everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we're going to dye some variegated yarn in a more repeating kind of colorway. It's not going to be perfectly repeating because of the way I'm going to have the yarn scrunched in a pan, though there will probably still be some softness to it, but a lot of times I don't dye yarn where the colors could pool. And so this is the kind of thing that we are creating today. A lot of times I try to dye yarn that specifically won't pool. And while this might not be planned pooling kind of yarn, it is a colorway that is much more likely to pool, depending on the way it's transformed, knit, or crocheted into a final garment. But we'll talk about that more. I'm aiming for some beautiful saturated colors for today's lab partner, Mary. Mary, thank you so much for being my lab partner today, and I really hope that you are gonna love this yarn. Now, I don't think my marker swatches here are the most accurate reflection of the colorway I'm trying to create, but I will be playing with Paradise Fibers acid dyes today in red, navy, blue, and green. The Paradise Fibers green is very, very teal, which I think is perfect for this colorway that I have in my brain. To achieve this colorway, we're actually going to start on my countertop, where we are going to dye 300 grams of Knit Picks Stroll Fingering Weight yarn. And we are going to be starting to dye our yarn cold with no acid. And the reason why we are starting cold is that way we can spread the colors through the yarn a little bit more. And the no acid, again, is to help us spread the colors. Since we are going to use dry powders to dye directly onto the yarn versus dissolving them in advance. Now, this could result in us getting some speckles. That's fine. My tap water is slightly acidic, so this is something that could occur. But the overall plan is to allow me to hand paint onto this yarn with dry powder, and then we will go ahead and heat set it. Now, this is something I could do over on the stove with things cold, but since my stove is currently hot, that's why we're going to start on the countertop here. I do have a yarn mop, a skein of Knit Picks Stroll Fingering Weight yarn that also has not pre-soaked in any acid that I'm going to have just off camera as a yarn mop in case I need it. Overall, once I'm adding the color onto the yarn, I will be working it through with my gloves, so some color left on my fingers doesn't matter that much. But I imagine when I take my hands out, they'll be covered in dye, and that's what I'll wipe on here before rinsing my gloves to go into the next color. I'm bringing over 8 cups of water, but I'm not going to add all of it onto the yarn. I'm going to add enough so that way, see that nice squish? I want to be able to do that because we need water to dissolve the dyes, but I don't want so much water that the yarn isn't on the bottom of the pan and it would allow the dye to sort of travel further than I want. But the colors are definitely going to spread some. I mean, that is something that 100% will happen here. Okay. I think that's nice and squished, and I added probably 4.5 cups, between 4 and 4.5 cups of water total. But now, since we're going to be dealing with these dry dye powders, I'm going to go put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves, so we can start dyeing our colorway. Let's start with the red, which I want overall to be a pretty small segment. Not like tiny, but I don't want it to be huge. And so I'm taking the powder and just trying to spread it out over on our section here. And I imagine I'm going to need to go into this color more than once. But look at the beautiful tone of this red. And you can see as I'm pushing to mix the dyes in, not only am I getting a lot of dye on my fingertips, but I am pushing the color down as well. And you know, we might need to do some kind of flip to add color to the other side, but it's also possible that with enough massaging, we can get the color to go through. But it does seem like it's sticking, or that it's not going through very far. But I think I want more. Now, the reason why you want your fingers to be dry before going back into the dye container is that you don't want to introduce a lot of moisture into the containers. That could cause the dyes to clump. And one thing that we can do over here as well So I'm going to lift the yarn a bit, sprinkle some dye beneath it. And I'm doing this to help me get good color penetration through to the other side. Not sure how I'm going to feel about this in the end. Certainly this feels messier. But I want to put the cover back on the dye. And I don't think that adding dye down below is something I can do with every section. But I can do some like mini flips of color within the yarn. And once we've started heating, I can flip the yarn. And if I feel like I need more color, then I can add more color in on the other side. Let's go ahead and do the blue next. This is a color where I don't mind. And in fact, I'd love the section to be a little bit bigger. Especially because if you consider the way that the red is at the end where the yarn bends, so we're going to have the color and then that same color sort of on the way back. Therefore, the navy section will end up being pretty small. But I don't know if this will mean the blue section might then be a little bit more equal to the red, but we'll see. It's been a while since I used these dyes, but look at this color. It is so pigmented and pretty. Oh my goodness. But the important thing here, because just a light tap gets it worked in, is I really want it to work in. I really want, see if we look, we can see that it's not all the way to the bottom. We'll see how much massaging of this will help the color push through. But it's possible that, you know, we won't be able to get extremely saturated in one pass. Yeah, I'm thinking, well, that's getting better. Because if I press it, there's a lot of color in there. And you can see as I'm pressing it, it is spreading things out more and more and more. That is okay, but I'm curious just how well this will work. Yeah, I think, you know, with this, we will probably just have to flip and add some color on the other side. And I think I'm going to need to be okay with that. But we shouldn't need to do like 10 flips. But I think that when it comes to adding more color, I would probably add a little bit and then quickly with a spoon come in. Right now, this is making me think of like a bomb popsicle. Let's go for the navy. This one I'm focusing on a smaller area. Again, we're going to try to work it through really, really well, but I'm going to start applying the dye to this small area. I'm curious how pigmented the navy is, and it's looking like it's very, very pigmented. And so as I'm working this one through, I'm doing mostly my fingertips, and I am doing a lot of like side to side wiggles to try to work it down. And I think that that's actually going pretty well. We may end up with some purplish hues in here, but that's not a super bad thing. Yeah, the navy is working through pretty well. It's possible that the blue, if I add more dye on top of it to kind of deepen it, it's possible that I might be able to work that further down as well. But of course, different pigments do strike to yarn at different rates. So that is something that also will come into play. I'm not adding like a ton more, but enough to like sort of combine it a little bit more with that navy. And maybe I need to do more wiggle like I did with the navy, and that'll help push it down. I mean, I would say that the colors that are remaining are a lot less. So I think I'm going to do as much of the dye application now as I can. All right, let's bring in the green and see how we do here. Yeah, because it's always the question, if depending on how much water there is, you can try to flip without causing too much of an issue. And by issue, I mean like, if we pick it up, we don't want the blue to spread all over the bottom of the pan and then end up covering the red in that blue. But look at this green. Isn't it pretty? It is a very, very, honestly, this is the most green it's ever looked to me versus looking just completely teal. but it is not a bright green, not at all. And so here, since we're at the edge, I feel like I'm doing a much better job at pushing it through. But you can see there are some white patches. And as I lift it, you see how there's water that pools? That is the reason why I do not want to necessarily flip it, because our dyes haven't had a chance to like start striking to the yarn at all yet. Now, as I'm doing this, the greens are spreading into the blues a little bit, but I feel like that's okay. How we're doing with the blues. Okay, you know what? The color is going through a lot more than it did. I think that it's just I wasn't touching it as much as I touched the other colors. Ooh, but now looking at this, I think what I want is actually to add a little bit of navy there. I think that I want to feel the navy or this deep color at the interface here, just like we did between the blue and the red. So that is what I am going to do. And you know, we're coming in, working it into this interface. I think that there was a little bit that spread down there, and that's okay. Again, this is not a perfect repeating colorway, but the goal is more to just have some fun with it. Okay, I think I actually really like this a lot. I mean, I'm not surprised that I like it. I don't mean it to come off that way, but I think I'm happy that I added the navy where I did. I wonder how even the red, green, and blue sections will feel. But now we need to start adding some acid. And so I'm pouring on just some white vinegar. And this is not spread out through our yarn at all yet. Okay, I did not count how many tablespoons that was, but I wanted to add enough so that way I would feel like we had reasonable coverage. And now, starting with our navies, and even though this one has some red, I'm going to go over to this one because we need to work the acid through, just like we worked the dyes through. And now it's more important for me to really wipe my hands off before going into another color, because I don't want to introduce, say, green onto the red if I can help it. Oh yeah, there's definitely some white patches there that we'll have to deal with. We'll see how much of the color starts to strike now that we have some acid in here, even though it's cold. There are definitely colors that will strike to this yarn base with very, very little acid, so we'll see. It's not a bad thing if that doesn't happen though. There definitely have been times where I have been able to get really good coverage just from applying dye to one side of yarn. Yeah, I mean, at least I'm happy with where we are on this side. And as for flipping, I mean, there's a fair amount of color. Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and let this sit for a little bit, maybe about 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and check in. As for our yarn mount, there isn't a ton of color in here, but I thought that we would take it and dip it in some hot water that had some acid. So that way we can both finally add some acid to it and set these colors a little bit before we use it as a yarn mount for the rest of the video. So we'll just get one layer. And I'm not even gonna leave it in the hot pot. I'm going to just dip it that last time, lift it up, drain a lot of that water. I know we're pretty steamy. And then I'm going to just set it aside to cool so that way we can use it when we finally start heating the yarn. But this did spread our colors. It softened them a little bit. And we still have a base where we can add a lot more color. It's been 10 minutes. And yeah, we have a lot of color in here. I think some of it is clearing a little bit, but like with the navy, that's just so much dye that if I were to lift it, it would spread everywhere. Which, again, isn't the end of the world. That's not what we're going for. So let's take this over to the stove. There is some amount of when I would flip to check, I could have flipped and left it to add color there. But again, I think that we're okay. So I'm gonna turn the heat on high at first, so that way the flames on the burner kind of have a bigger circumference. And then I'm gonna reduce the heat to low. I do have the rest of just the plain water off camera that I can add more of as needed. And actually, since I still have 3.5 cups of water over there, I'm gonna go ahead, or off camera I added 4 tablespoons of white vinegar to that. So that way as I come in eventually, and add more water, like if I come and just add a little bit more, not that this is what I needed to do right now, but if I add more, I'm also adding more acid. So that is also coming into play. But let's check in on this after about 10 minutes. And you can see I'm already getting some steam pockets there, so I'm now going to reduce the heat to medium. And then as things go, I'll reduce it to low. I'll keep a close eye on it. It's been 10 minutes and I just added a little bit of that water with acid. And so in some areas, we're still seeing some color, probably around the edges. In other areas, it is more clear. It's possible that we had uneven acid distribution. Let's see. The navy is one that's taking a little bit longer, but especially at the edges where it's probably a little bit cooler. This navy is starting to look pretty clear now. It wasn't like even a minute ago. And okay, the red, I'm seeing some pockets. Sort of pressing down on it is also helping if there was some dye powder just kind of sitting there that hadn't been wet. The green looks really well dissolved. It's just helping with that. So I'm gonna give this, I think, another 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and flip the yarn. All right, there's a little bit of color in here, but I wanna flip. There's a little bit with the navy as well. And a lot of times when I flip, I swap the sides. So I'll like pick this up and flip it down there. But instead, I'm gonna flip, rotate, and try to put this back where it was. So that way, like, those reds don't spread too much. And okay, this is pretty good. Now, when we add color on now to like fix these spots, I'm debating. I want to do it with the dry powder again, but the problem is that we're going to introduce a little bit more variation in here because it's not going to be nearly as soft as it was before. But now that I think about it, I think one of the things with the Paradise Fibers dyes that I've really, really liked is that the colors maybe strike a little bit slower, which allows me to spread them a little more. And so hopefully that's the case. And so what I'm going to do now is put my mask back on, and we're going to start trying to, quote, fix the areas that need more color. And I say fix a little bit with air quotes because it's not that there's something really wrong here. You could certainly keep these light patches here intentionally. It's just not what we're going for with this particular yarn. And I'm trying to go pretty quickly from adding the dye to coming to my spoon to spread this color out. Not like super fast, but as fast as I can to try to help spread these colors out and make them even. And I can even come in with a little bit of water to aid with that. And we will be opening up the yarn to like check again, but my goal is to try to not have a ton of super white patches. Now, our navy area will definitely need some color, and we'll be dealing with that in a little bit. But before we get to the navy, I'm going to stretch out the blue so that way we can expose more of those areas where I need that color. Okay, and I'm going to come in with the blue, and I'm also trying to spread the dye out as much as I can versus letting it go heavy in a section. And it's okay if some of it ends up in the space that will end up covering up more with the navy. I might need to come back in and get more of it, but with that little bit and a quick stop at the yarn mop, I'm going to start trying to spread out this color that I added. Now, it might be a little easier if I came with the spoon and was ready just like immediately to move things and to shift it. That might be easier. I will say that the blue is looking deeper here than it is in some other areas. So I am going to come dry my hand and add more blue all over, because in general I want to deepen this color, which I don't remember if it felt less deep on the other side, But adding more pigments in here will help have like a level of consistency. And actually, I wish I had thought to bring in, I have a spoon, like a slotted spoon, that is a little bit bigger. That might have been helpful here today as we come to sort of spread this color out. But you can see that having stretched things out versus having it scrunched is really going to let me spread the color a little bit more, have a little bit more control over where some of this color goes, and things like that. And so then I can pick up some of that color and bring it over to another spot where I want a little bit more. And now I'm sort of bringing this back down and scrunching that up. If some of the blue spreads that way, that isn't a big deal to me. But I'm looking at our green now, and I can see just a little bit of space where I want some more green. Coming in with just a little bit of it. Don't forget that this navy I added over the green to begin with. But our goal is to cover up as much of the white areas as possible. And with this color, I'm going to want it to go back sort of the other way. And it's because of the way that like we flip the yarn, it is possible that there are some colors that will sort of mix and blend onto the other side. This is again why it's not really planned pooling, because when you have things sort of all mixed up, that's sort of the way that it goes. But I think we can sort of stretch things out in this kind of way to start trying to bring in some navy. I think the navy is the Paradise Color Fibers color I've used the least out of all of them so far. And right now I'm going to start just at this spot, and then we'll come back to the other one. And I'm going to do it one at a time to give me time to spread the color. Whoop. That may have been a little bit more onto the red than I wanted. That's okay. Because if I had gone ahead and done the other color right away, then we would have ended up with something a little bit more speckly, which isn't necessarily bad, but is also not necessarily what I wanted. And there are some areas where I would like it to spread a little bit. So now we can come in with the navy again, and this area is not really straight across anymore. So I'm just kind of doing the best that I can, and then coming with the spoon to initially softly spread it, but then a little more vigorously help it spread out. And we're going to flip the yarn again to see how things are going. But I think what I want to do now is come in with a little bit more water, and I'm going to put this on the navy specifically. Don't forget there's acid in here already. On the navy, and then I'm going to come in and add some to the blue. Maybe a little bit on the red, a little bit on the green. And let's go ahead and wait about 10 minutes. It's so funny with how working with dyes that I haven't used that frequently again. Okay, that navy is still hanging around. But I'm tempted to lift and try to flip anyway, because I want to see how many spots like that there are that are still white. It's funny how using a color I haven't used for a while can be just like really, really interesting when it comes to not remembering how well it does or does not strike to the yarn. It's looking like we're pretty good. I'm just seeing as I lift and flip like a couple of tiny places where I think I need more color. So I popped my respirator back on and just went and got a little bit of red and a little bit of blue to finish this up. Okay, I'm gonna let this sit for 5 minutes and then we'll come and add more water. As for our yarn mop, this dye bath is much, much cooler now, but it is the same one that we used before. I'm waiting to get a little bit of stove space, but I'm I'm gonna do the same kind of thing we did before and just sort of dip the yarn in, letting the colors spread out a bit. And the dye bath is not yet cold. There is a warmth to it. But once we get some space over on the stove, then we'll bring it over there and heat for 30 minutes. It's been 5 minutes, and now I'm gonna come in with the rest of that water and vinegar that I had mixed previously, which is giving us a lot more liquid here in the pan, and should help if there's some undissolved dye. It just should help make sure things are nice and wet. I am seeing now that I'm moving it a couple other pastel patches, which I'm gonna, I think, oh man, I was gonna say, like, I'm not gonna do anything about, no, it's not white. I think it's just pastel. Maybe there's one with a white patch. Oh goodness. Okay, well, I'm gonna quickly fix this one that I see off camera. I don't see any others right now. Odds are we'll find some others. But then I'm gonna let the yarn heat for 30 minutes. It would have been 25, but we'll let it heat 30 minutes after I add a little bit of dye there. I'm ready to remove the yarn from the pan. It's cooled off in here for a little bit. All right, I do see a little bit of some light patches, but they're not glaring. I'm not going, oh no, immediately. So that is good. We'll see what we see when the yarn is dry. Yeah, there are some more pastel areas, but you know what? I think it's fine. It adds some character. I have been able to get even better coverage on some other projects, and so I think I'm gonna have to go look and see what it was that I had done, so that way I know what to do moving forward. But anyway, I'm gonna set this aside to finish cooling so then we can wash it. And I'm also gonna remove our yarn mop, which is glorious. You know, this overall effect here is very similar, but maybe with some smaller patches of color, to what we get with the shoebox method. I've explored doing stuff like this in the past and in Leave No Dye Behind videos, but I'm thinking I need to do this for just Dyepot Weekly, and we should do adding powder onto yarn. Maybe not speckles, but just powder, and then dip dyeing it. I'm excited to do that again. But anyway, I'm gonna set this with the rest of the yarn to finish cooling. Let's wash all of this yarn together. All right, putting it in. The yarn has all cooled. Now, there was another project that I worked on recently where I had some issues with potentially the Paradise Fibers red, and some of the color not striking, but that does not seem to be having an issue. I'm not seeing any bleeding or particulates come out in the water, which is good. I think that, yeah, the other project may have just been a bit different. But anyway, let's fill this back up and add a little bit of some soap. Just a little bit of some clear dish soap. I really like the tone of the True Blue. I love the juxtaposition of the variegated yarn that we dyed next to the more random yarn mop, which I think is more similar to the way I often go about dyeing yarn. But I do enjoy pushing myself out of my comfort zone because for all that there's a type of yarn I love to knit with, I like to explore and try and different things because I think that makes more fun videos to watch, but also I think it helps me grow as an artist and a dyer. Thankfully, we're seeing no bleeding here, so I'm gonna finish rinsing out the soap, then go ahead and put the yarn through my spin dryer and hang it up to dry. It's not perfect. I am, now that it's dry, seeing a lot more pastel patches, but there were actually white patches that we did manage to cover up. And I think that the colorway is fun and pretty. The pop of red is very different for me. A lot of times I go with colors that are really like on just one section of the wheel. What's that, analogous colors? And so we have some more contrast here with our teal and the red, and I think that it'll knit up and have lots of pops of fun. If this were a colorway, which it's not, then I was trying to create for planned pooling, which again is something I've never done and I'm actually a little afraid of. You would not want to dye it scrunched up in the pan. You would want to make sure things were straight so that way you could have all the color repeats be even. And then you wouldn't see some of the diagonal lines or some of the more soft edges that we have towards the end. This is a colorway that will pool. I just don't think it's good enough that you could do the math and figure out the stitch width so that way you could get an awesome pooling plaid that can occur with planned pooling projects. I don't know, the idea of dyeing for that just terrifies me. There was a time recently in my real life versus recently in the order of videos that you have watched where I started with no acid and applied the dye and got enough coverage all at once that I didn't need to add more. At least I'm thinking that I used powder. I don't remember. Now that I'm thinking about it, one thing that maybe I wish I had done is that I had applied all of the colors without pushing it in at first and then flipped it before pushing things in so things would be less likely to run. That might have allowed me to apply more color in areas. Another thing I think I could have done is when the yarn was in the hot dye bath, I would stretch it. So I would take the yarn from being sort of scrunched in the pan and scrunch all the colors down one way to straighten out where, say, the navy section was. I could have done that while things were cool in the pan. And trying to do that may have resulted in some blending of colors, but that may have also just helped me get more coverage and deeper coverage on the yarn. One other thing I could have done would be to have only 200 grams of yarn in the pan, because then the yarn would be spread out more, the layers would be less thick, and that's just another way that I could get deeper coverage. I am determined to play around with techniques for creating more repeating colorways, even though I tend to prefer to work with colorways that are non-repeating. That's just my preference. I enjoy dyeing the randomness, but I'd like to get better and more confident with my variegated techniques because I do really like this colorway. It's just a little different from what was in my head, and so I want to practice more so I can get closer to achieving the thing I am visualizing in my brain. As my kid's second grade teacher would say, practice makes better. And I really, really love that statement. Today's yarn mop is the type of colorway I find myself dyeing a lot more. It's something that has a lot of random color patches, but also has a softness to it from letting the colors sort of bleed together a bit. And I think that it is really, really beautiful. I enjoy having variegated yarns that knit up really randomly, and so the colors show up in like a very planned random pattern. It's like when I make a quilt and I try to plan for things to be as random as possible so they look like there's a great distribution, but there's not a pattern to the colors. That's the type of feeling I like when I'm knitting. But I don't know, maybe that's just me. Do you like yarn that pools, or do you prefer things that are more random? Please let me know down below. Mary, thank you so much for being my lab partner for today's episode of Dyepot Weekly. I had a lot of fun creating this colorway, and I'm having fun trying to challenge myself to go with colorways that are outside of my first instinct. Which isn't to say that you shouldn't go with your gut. Going with your gut when you're creating art is really, really important. But the way that, at least for me, I continue to grow and change is by challenging myself with the images in my head and therefore going for things that aren't purple, blue, and teal. If I was going with my gut, I think that's where I would stay all the time. And so that's what I mean when it comes to pushing myself. But again, Mary, thank you so much for being my lab partner. And if you at home would like to learn more about how you can become a lab partner like Mary, go and check out the lab partner and last minute lab partner listings in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. There are a lot of other ways that you can help support the content here on the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel. The biggest thing you can do is subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. and do things like leaving comments and giving the videos a like. All of that is free and really helps the channel continue to grow. You can also join to become a channel member, and for as little as $1 a month, you can get badges next to your name that show up in the chat and down in the comments section, and you get to play with some really fun ChemKnits emotes. You can find more information about becoming a channel member by clicking on the join button and watching the video that you should see down by the channel name on YouTube. The problem I have when it comes to hand painting yarn with liquid dyes is that you end up with so much water by the time you're done. And so if you don't mix the dyes concentrated enough, then it doesn't spread in the yarn far enough, or if it's too concentrated, then it spreads too much. And so I'm just trying to play around with ways that feel more comfortable to me. And honestly, a lot of times I don't like bothering to make dye stocks. I like dealing with the dry powder directly. Maybe it's because you're skipping that step. I don't know. I'm just being honest. But I am really happy with the way that these colors came together. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and thank you so much for watching.